On the afternoon of Wednesday, April 12, 2006, a dentist named Dr. John Yelnick was just finishing up with his last patient of the day. His practice was located in the small, rural community of Blairsville, Pennsylvania. He handed the patient a free toothbrush, told her to come back in 6 months for her next checkup, and then he walked into his back office to pack up his things for the day. Once he had everything together, he walked out through the reception area. He told his receptionist to have a wonderful night, and she waved back and gave him a big, friendly smile. But as soon as John stepped out of the building and the door closed behind him, that cheerful expression completely vanished from his face. The truth was, John had a lot of problems weighing on him, and pretending to be happy and untroubled all day at work was becoming incredibly exhausting. And so, John walked across the parking lot, got into his car, and started the short half-mile drive from his dental practice to the small house he was living in. John had actually grown up right there in Blairsville. It had been his lifelong dream to build a life and raise a family in his hometown. So, when he graduated from dental school about 13 years earlier, he had a choice. He could have easily set up his practice in a big city and probably made a much higher salary right from the start. But instead, he decided to come home and join the practice of his own childhood dentist right there in downtown Blairsville. And it turned out to be a great decision. John was able to make a lot of money in his hometown. His dental practice really took off, partly because John himself was just a really charming guy. He was great with kids, and so families from all over the area wanted to come to him. With the extra money he was making, which was way more than he ever expected, he started investing in real estate. By the time he was in his 30s, John Yelnick was a millionaire. But it wasn't until he met his wife, Michelle, that he truly felt like his life was complete. Michelle was a single mother with 2 children already, and for John, this was perfect. It meant she came with a ready-made family that he could love as his own. Some of John's friends were a bit worried. They thought maybe Michelle was only interested in him for his money. But then, John's mother got sick with cancer, and Michelle stepped up without hesitation. She became his mother's full-time caregiver, looking after her with incredible compassion. For John, that was all the proof he needed. He knew then that Michelle truly cared for him and his family, and so the two of them got married in 1997. Shortly after their marriage, they adopted a little boy together who they named JJ. Now, with their 3 children, this big, new family moved into a beautiful house with a swimming pool and a hot tub. On the outside, it looked like everything was absolutely perfect, but now, as John pulled his car into the driveway of his current home, it was a much more modest place. He just sat there for a moment, staring at this little house he was living in, and he couldn't help but wonder how everything had fallen apart so completely. These days, John was extremely tight on money. He was a generous person, and he'd lent tens of thousands of dollars to various people over the years. But now, he was in the difficult position of having to ask for that money back because he literally needed it to get by. And then there was his marriage. He and Michelle had hit a horrible rough patch that just never seemed to end. They had both admitted to having affairs, and so now they were living separately. That was why John was pulling up to this small, quiet house instead of the big family home with the pool and the hot tub. But as bad as the financial stress and the marital problems were, they weren't the worst thing in John's life. There was a third stressor, one that was far more terrifying. John was absolutely convinced that somebody was going to murder him. This fear had started about 2 weeks earlier. Someone had vandalized his car with spray paint. The police had looked into it, but they couldn't figure out who had done it. And on its own, having your car spray painted doesn't automatically mean someone wants to kill you. But for John, it just felt different. It felt personal, like someone was specifically targeting him. And over the next several days, that feeling grew from my car was vandalized to my car was vandalized, and I think it means someone is trying to kill me. John believed this so strongly that he had recently gone to see his attorney. He gave her $10,000 in cash. He told her it was just in case he ended up dead. She could use that money to help investigate his murder. Now, John finally got out of his car. He walked up the porch steps, went into his home, and closed and locked the door behind him. The house was so quiet, and it just made him feel even more depressed. He wished his adopted son, JJ, was there. JJ always made the house feel so much more alive. But these days, John didn't get to see him very much. Long stretches of time would pass between their visits. John took off his shoes and walked into the living room. There, on the coffee table, was a stack of legal documents that he had been avoiding. They were divorce papers. Michelle had actually filed for divorce 3 years earlier, back in 2003, but she and John had never been able to come to a final agreement. To be clear, they weren't fighting to try and save the marriage. That was long over. In fact, Michelle was already living with a new boyfriend, a Pennsylvania state trooper named Kevin Foley. The reason the divorce had dragged on for so long was because of what they were fighting over. It was JJ, their adopted son. Michelle wanted full custody, and John absolutely refused to give up his son. But John knew that in less than 24 hours, this long, painful battle would finally be over. Their lawyers had at last settled on a shared custody agreement. Michelle had already signed her part of the paperwork, and tomorrow it would be John's turn to sign. And so John sat down on his couch and turned on the television. But he couldn't focus on the show. He was just too restless, too anxious. He picked up the phone and called his aunt, who he was very close with. He talked with her for a while about the divorce and the custody agreement. When they finally said their goodbyes, John hung up the phone. He stretched out on the couch, and right there in the living room, he fell asleep. The next day, around 3:30 in the afternoon, a 9-year-old boy named Zach Hughes, who lived right next door to John, walked out of his front door and across the lawn towards John's house. Zach wanted to see if John's son, JJ, was around and could come out to play. He wasn't sure if JJ would be there since he split his time between his mom's and his dad's places, but he figured it was worth a shot. But when Zach got to the front steps of John's house, he stopped. He noticed something was wrong. There was a small glass panel to the left of the front door, and it had been completely shattered. There was broken glass all over the porch, and Zach could also see streaks of what looked like a dried, red liquid right underneath the broken panel. Immediately, Zach got scared. He saw it and thought it had to be blood. His first instinct was to turn and run away as fast as he could, but then he thought about his friend, JJ. He was worried that maybe JJ was inside and in some kind of trouble. He couldn't just leave him. So, gathering up all the courage a 9-year-old boy could, Zach slowly and nervously walked up the rest of the steps to the front door. He tried the doorknob, but the door was locked. And so, as carefully as he could, Zach reached his small hand through the broken glass panel, trying his best not to cut himself on the sharp edges. He reached inside and was able to turn the lock from the inside. Then he opened the door. As soon as he stepped into the house, he saw it. There were papers strewn all over the floor of the foyer, and in the middle of it all, there was a body. It was laying motionless on the floor, covered in blood. At that point, Zach didn't hesitate. He turned around and he ran. About 15 minutes later, Corporal Janelle Lade of the Blairsville Borough Police Department was driving in her car with her husband and their 4 children. She got a call from dispatch. A 911 call had come in from a normally very quiet residential street, but the details were still a little confusing. All dispatch could tell her was that there had been a cardiac arrest and that she was needed at the scene. There was no other information. So, thinking it was probably a routine medical call, like a heart attack, Corporal Lade just drove her family straight over to the address. But when she pulled up to the home and got out of her vehicle, she knew immediately that this was not a simple heart attack. She saw a patrol officer waiting for her on the porch, and the look on his face was grim. Lade walked over to him, and he immediately pointed to the broken glass panel and the dark stains on the ground. She asked him what was going on. She told him she was told this was a cardiac arrest. The officer just looked at her and said, "You know what? It's probably best if you just go in and see for yourself." So Lade turned and waved to her husband and kids, trying to signal that everything was fine and she just needed a minute. Then she stepped inside the house. And right away, she was stunned by what she saw. The entire foyer was splashed with blood. It was on the floor, on the walls, and there, in the center of it all, amongst all the scattered papers, was the most mutilated body she had ever seen in her life. Now, Corporal Lade had never actually worked a homicide case before, but as she stood there trying and failing to count the number of stab wounds on the man's body, she knew without a doubt that this was not a cardiac arrest. This was her very first murder case. She also knew she needed backup and she needed it fast. Because the call had been mistakenly logged as a medical emergency, the police had not sent a full response. It was just her and the one patrol officer on the scene. Lade was suddenly very aware that the killer, or killers, could still be in the area, maybe even still inside the house. They hadn't even secured the property yet, and she was thinking about how she had brought her husband and her children with her. They were sitting in the car right outside, so she immediately instructed the patrol officer to search the rest of the house. Then she went back out onto the front lawn to essentially stand guard between the murder scene and her family, her hand resting on the gun in her holster. Luckily, it wasn't long before Lade heard the sound of approaching emergency sirens in the distance. At the same time, the patrol officer came out of the house and told her it was empty. The killer or killers were gone. The only new discovery the officer had made was a huge puddle of blood in the basement, where the victim's blood had seeped through the floorboards from above. At this point, Lade said goodbye to her husband and kids and sent them home. Then she went back into detective mode and stepped back inside the house. It was around then that someone on the scene told Lade the victim's name. They said his name was John Yelnick. As the crime scene technicians began their work, carefully processing all the physical evidence inside the house, Lade started a slow walk through each of the rooms. She was trying to get a sense of who John was and also to piece together how he had died. John's body was found close to the front door, but it was clear that the attack that led to his death had been long and chaotic. There was blood all over the living room floor, which was also covered in those divorce papers. John's body was barefoot, but there were bloody shoe prints in the house that were far too big to belong to the little boy, Zach. Lade figured they must belong to the killer. The crime scene techs were already measuring the prints, trying to determine the shoe size. As Lade continued through the house, she didn't see anything that looked like it could have been used as a murder weapon. She also didn't see any evidence of a robbery. The television was still there. No drawers or cabinets appeared to have been opened or rummaged through. And to Lade, this made sense. The murder was extremely violent, which suggested it was very personal. It seemed like the only thing the killer wanted when they came into this house was for John to die a horrible death. She finished her sweep of the home, ending up back in the living room where it looked like the attack had begun. And that's when she noticed a check on the coffee table right next to some of the divorce papers. The check was made out to the victim, John Yelnick, for $15,000. And attached to the check was a note asking John to hold off for a few days before he deposited it. The check and the note were from someone named Melissa, and when Lead saw the last name, she did a double take. It was Use, the same last name as the neighborhood boy Zach who had discovered the body. Lead wondered if Melissa Use was related to Zach Use, and so now, Corporal Lead realized that right there on the coffee table she had her first two solid leads. One, her victim was in the middle of a very messy divorce, and two, someone, possibly his next-door neighbor, owed him a lot of money that she apparently couldn't afford to pay back all at once. It was evening by the time Lead finally stepped back outside the house. When she did, she saw a crowd had gathered. There were neighbors and reporters all jostling for position out on the street. Blairsville almost never had murders, so Lead knew this was going to be a huge story. But for now, she just had to get past them and get back to the station. She needed to get organized for the interviews she'd be conducting tomorrow. But before she could even walk down the front steps, another officer came over to her with an update. Over the past few hours, police had fanned out across the neighborhood, talking to people to see if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual. And they had come back with two very interesting accounts. The first came from a woman who said that the previous night, around 1:30 in the morning, she had been woken up by the sound of a scream. She said she sat up and listened, but the screaming didn't continue, so she had eventually just gone back to sleep. The second account came from another neighbor who had also heard something around that same time. This neighbor said they heard a man yelling, and it sounded like a very heated argument. The neighbor couldn't make out everything the man was saying, but there was one sentence that was yelled very clearly, and that was, "I'll never loan you money again." Instantly, when Lead heard that, she thought of the $15,000 check on the coffee table. This seemed to add a lot more weight to the idea that money might have been the motive for this murder. But the officer said he wasn't finished. He had one more important piece of information for her. In addition to those witness statements, a lot of John's neighbors had told the police that there was one family in particular on the block that detectives really needed to look into, and that was the Use family. Because, according to the neighborhood gossip, Melissa Use and John Yelnick had been having an affair. The following day, April 14th, Corporal Lead was at the police station. She was sitting at a table inside an interrogation room, directly across from Melissa Use and her husband Tom. Again, Lade had never worked a murder case before, but she was a very methodical investigator, and she had a plan for how she was going to handle her persons of interest. First, she was going to go very hard at Melissa and Tom Use, even though in her mind they weren't her top suspects. At this point, her top suspects were John's soon-to-be ex-wife, Michelle, and her new boyfriend, Kevin. And the reason for that was simple. She had been told that in a murder case, the divorcing spouse and their new partner are always suspects number 1 and 2. The night before, Lade had sent an officer to Michelle's house to tell her that her estranged husband was dead. But when the officer got there, Michelle already knew. She said she had heard that John had died of a heart attack. So the officer had to break the news to both Michelle and her boyfriend Kevin that it was actually a murder. And according to the officer's report, they both seemed genuinely shocked. Corporal Lade actually knew Michelle's boyfriend, Kevin, personally. He was a state police trooper, and they had worked together on cases before. But now, Lade was going to have to investigate her own colleague, which was obviously a very delicate situation, especially among police officers. And so, what Lade wanted to do was gather more information before she spoke directly to Michelle and Kevin. First, she wanted to try and rule out the Uses as suspects. She also wanted to get the results of the autopsy, which was scheduled to take place later that day. So now, Lade looked across the interrogation table at John's neighbors, Melissa and Tom Use. She began by asking them about the $15,000 check that Melissa had written to John, the one found near his body. Melissa answered in a very shaky voice. She explained that she and John had been friends since they were in 9th grade. She was planning to open a new bakery in town, and John had loaned her the money to help her get started. But then, kind of out of nowhere, he had asked for the money back. Melissa said she was really disappointed when he did that, but she also knew John was going through a very expensive divorce, so she understood. She said she only had $14,000 in her account when she wrote the check. That's why she had left the note with it, asking him not to cash it for a few days until she could get the last $1,000 together. Lade watched Melissa closely as she spoke. She did seem truly distraught over John's death. The money issue really didn't seem to be a big deal to her at all, compared to the loss of her friend. But the obvious warmth that Melissa clearly felt for John raised another, more sensitive question, and Lade decided she couldn't just dance around it, even though Melissa was sitting right there next to her husband, Tom. Lade looked directly at Melissa and asked her straight out if she was having an affair with John. Melissa immediately blushed and said no. She insisted they were just close friends, nothing more. At this point, Lade turned to Melissa's husband, Tom, and asked him the same question. Was his wife having an affair with John? For a second, Tom just sat there in silence. But when he finally spoke, he didn't sound angry or upset. He just seemed really nervous. He basically refused to answer the question. Instead, he just kept repeating that he really needed to go and take care of his kids. Now, Lade knew it had been a very blunt question to ask, but Tom's reaction was extremely suspicious. So by the time Lade told Melissa and Tom that they were free to go, Tom had firmly established himself in her mind as a clear person of interest. Before Lade left the station for the day, she checked in with one of her officers, who she had sent to observe John's autopsy. The officer told her that the forensic pathologist had determined the killer used a one-sided blade to repeatedly slash John during the fight. In addition to the knife wounds, John's jugular vein had been cut by a piece of glass. John also had defensive wounds on his hands as well as cuts on his back, which suggested that at one point he had tried to run away. Lade already knew it was a brutal murder, but hearing the details from the autopsy just reinforced how much hatred must have been behind it. And so, after hearing these details, Lade thought to herself that whoever did this must have truly deeply hated John. And she was already thinking she had one suspect, Tom Hughes, whose wife might have been having an affair with the victim. That would certainly be a powerful enough motive to inspire that level of hatred. Despite her inexperience with homicide cases, Lade felt confident that she would be able to solve this as long as she was allowed to work slowly and methodically, just like she always had on every other case. But this case was already getting a lot of attention in the news. And so, Lade knew there would be pressure to show results and to show them fast. If she moved too slowly, the case might get taken away from her, or another police agency might be called in to help speed things up. Lade didn't want that to happen, but she also refused to compromise her methodical process. She figured she would just have to find a way to strike a balance. The officer who had gone to the autopsy had come back with some evidence: John Yelnick's fingernail clippings, blood samples, and some tissue samples. Lade was supposed to send these off to a state police lab for DNA testing. But Lade decided, now that she had these samples in her possession, that she was not going to do that. Lade wanted to keep all of her investigative options open and to make sure that she knew every single thing that was happening with her evidence in this case. And so, after the officer left, Lade took the samples to the department refrigerator, put them inside, and then she went home. The next day was April 15th, 2 days after John Yelnick was murdered. By this point, Corporal Lade had spoken to a number of John's friends and family members. They had all painted a picture of John as a great guy and a very dedicated father. Today, Lade was going to John's dental practice to talk to his colleagues to see if they had anything different to say, and as soon as she arrived at the office, she was glad she had come. The dental hygienists and the receptionist had a lot to say about John's soon-to-be ex-wife, Michelle Yelnick. During the long, multi-year divorce battle, Michelle had at one point accused John of abusing their adopted son, JJ. Even Michelle's own family hadn't believed her, and officials had declined to press any charges. But during all the back and forth, Michelle had accused John of violating a stay-away order. The police had come and arrested him right there at his work, in front of his colleagues and patients. So, to John's colleagues, Michelle was a total nightmare. They also said she called the office regularly to demand money and that John often caved in and just gave it to her. But, according to one of the hygienists, Michelle had called just a few days before the murder, and that time, John had actually refused to even speak to her. This detail definitely caught Lade's attention. It wasn't just the colleagues at the dental practice who said Michelle was money hungry. A lot of John's friends said the same thing. They said it was Michelle who had wanted the big house with the pool and the hot tub. John had never really felt comfortable with that kind of flashy lifestyle, and to many of his friends and colleagues, it was that fundamental difference between them that ultimately drove them apart. And so Lade started to wonder. Maybe John and Michelle had a fight about money just a few days before his murder. Maybe Michelle had called demanding money, and John, for the first time, refused. Could that have been enough to push Michelle to murder him? It was possible. But then Lade discovered something else. Michelle was still listed as the beneficiary of John's life insurance policy. If John died, she stood to inherit millions of dollars. So now there was a twofold financial motive for Michelle to want John dead. But it didn't seem likely that Michelle on her own would have been able to overpower John and inflict all those wounds. It just seemed like he would have been able to fight her off. But Lade thought maybe Michelle hired someone to do it. Someone bigger and stronger. She certainly would have had the money to pay for it. As Lade left the dental office, she began to think about how she was going to approach Michelle. Given the sensitivity of the fact that Michelle was dating a cop, Lade did not want to make her move too soon, not without more evidence. This wasn't just the first murder case she had ever worked. It was the biggest case, period, that she had ever handled. Reporters were calling her constantly. This was a really big deal, and she did not want to screw it up. John Yelnick's funeral was held on Wednesday, April 19th, 6 days after the murder. Corporal Lade knew that his friends and family were already starting to get antsy. They wanted to know why the investigation seemed to be moving so slowly, and Lade understood where they were coming from. From day one, there was an enormous amount of media pressure to solve this case right away. That was weighing on the friends and family. And then there was the fact that John himself had been so paranoid that he was going to be murdered. And now he had turned up dead. It just seemed like too much of a coincidence. But Lade also felt that John's family just didn't understand why this was taking so long. She wasn't just being slow, she was being careful. That was her way. Without any real departmental guidance on how to work a homicide, Lade had developed her own very careful method. And for the next several months, she continued to follow her own protocol. She took her time, but she did it with intention. The crime scene unit hadn't turned up any matchable DNA or fingerprints at the scene. The bloody footprints they found didn't belong to any of her suspects. So for now, Lade was relying heavily on interviews. And she ran down every single tip and rumor she could find, systematically ruling things out one by one. And as she did this, she always kept tabs on her 3 best suspects: Tom Hughes, Kevin Foley, and Michelle Yelnick. But she made no move to arrest any of them. Sometimes, the complaints from the public and from John's own family about her failure to solve the case more quickly did get to her. But she was determined to manage the case her way. She felt like she was on the right path. That was until Melissa Hughes hired a pair of psychics. It was the summer of 2000, about 3 months after the murder, when Lade got a call from Melissa. Lade was actually pretty surprised to hear from her, and she was even more surprised when Melissa told her she wanted to meet at John's house. When Lade showed up, Melissa was there, but she wasn't alone. She was standing on the sidewalk with 2 older women who she introduced as psychic sisters. She said she had met them at a psychic tea party and that they had visions about the case. Lade was not happy about this. And she was even less happy to learn that John's own family had given permission for the psychics to enter his house. But Lade also knew that John's family was getting really edgy, and if she wanted more time to work on her case, she needed to placate them. If that meant working with these psychics that one of her suspects' wives had hired, then that's what she was going to do. So Lade followed Melissa and the psychic sisters as they walked into John's front yard and started talking about feeling hot and cold patches of energy. Lade was doing her best not to roll her eyes. Then they went into the house, which still hadn't been cleaned out and was still splattered with blood. The psychic sisters had a premonition. They said the killing had happened in the dining room area. Then the psychics said they saw a knife and they saw stab wounds and a bloody footprint. They said the killer drove a black or red car and that the killer was not Melissa's husband, Tom. Melissa seemed really excited by all of this. But to Lade, it was all ridiculous. The blood they were literally looking at made it pretty obvious where the killing had happened. And the details of John's death and the huge police investigation had been all over the news. The things the psychics were saying were things anyone could have easily learned before showing up. And the fact that these psychics, who Melissa herself had hired, were now conveniently clearing her husband was not very convincing. As the group finally left the house, the only thing Lade thought the psychics had been good for was taking some of the pressure off of her slow but steady investigation. She knew that at this point, John's family had lost faith in her, but what they didn't know was that she still had one more card to play. She just had to wait for the right time to use it. Fast forward to February of 2007, 10 months after the murder. At this point, Corporal Lade finally got her chance. John's cousins made an impassioned plea to the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office, asking them to take over the investigation. Lade's cooperation with the psychics had bought her a little bit of time, but ultimately, both John's family and Melissa Hughes had gotten more and more agitated by her slow pace. They felt like the psychics had given them just as much information as the police had, and the Attorney General ultimately agreed. This meant Lade was losing her case. On the one hand, this was the exact thing that Lade had been most worried about, that some bigger agency would come in and take over. But on the other hand, the Attorney General's office was not the agency she had expected. And so now, even though it definitely stung, Lade realized that she could finally make the play she had been sitting on for almost a year. And so, Lade went to that refrigerator in the Blairsville police station and took out the little container of fingernail clippings and other tissue samples from John Yelnick. Her officer had brought them to her right after John's autopsy. She had been told to send them to the state police crime lab right away, but she hadn't. In a total breach of protocol, she had decided not to do that, and instead she put the samples in the fridge and she waited. But now, with the Attorney General very publicly stepping in, it made the case much more high profile, and that in turn allowed Lade to send the samples not to the state police crime lab, but to the FBI crime lab, a much higher authority. Normally, the FBI would never take samples from a small-town murder case. But now that it was this huge public case making national news, Lade knew she could take advantage of the situation. So, she repackaged the fingernail clippings and the other samples, she sent them off to the FBI, and she waited. The day the results came back, Lead was very nervous. There was a chance that she was about to look very stupid for sitting on this evidence for as long as she had. But as she sat at her computer and opened the email with the DNA results, her eyes went wide. She almost couldn't believe what she was reading. Her strategy of intentionally slow-playing the investigation and sitting on this evidence until this very moment had totally paid off. Finally, on her computer screen, Corporal Lade was looking at the name of John Yelnick's killer. Based on the evidence collected at the crime scene and tested by the FBI, this is a reconstruction of what authorities believe happened in the early morning hours of April 13, 2006. Around 12:30 in the morning, the killer drove their red car onto a quiet residential street in Blairsville. They eventually came to a stop in front of a modest brick home. There, they cut their lights. The killer got out and looked around the neighborhood to make sure no one was watching. It was dark and completely silent. So the killer left the street, walked around to the back of the house, and slipped inside through an unlocked back door. Once inside, the killer walked through the dining room and then into the living room, where they found John Yelnick sleeping on the couch. The killer gripped a single-edged knife in their fist. They walked right up to John, raised the blade high, and then brought it down directly onto him. Instantly, John woke up and began screaming. He put his hands up to try to protect himself and even tried clawing at his attacker, getting the killer's skin underneath his fingernails. John eventually rolled off the couch, desperate to get away. He got up and began to stumble away, but the killer chased him down and the two began to wrestle. As they struggled, the killer kept stabbing John. John was flailing his arms, trying to fight back, and he hit the divorce papers on the coffee table, sending them flying everywhere. And then, somehow, on pure adrenaline, John broke away from the killer and tried to run for the front door. He made it to the front foyer and actually reached for the front doorknob. But the killer shoved him from behind. John went flying towards the pane of glass to the side of the door, and his head crashed right through it. When his head went through the glass, a sharp shard severed his jugular vein, and John bled to death right there in the foyer. The killer watched until John was completely still. At that point, they walked back out of the home, tracking John's blood with them. The killer was very confident they would never be caught, primarily because they were someone people trusted with their lives. The killer was Michelle's new boyfriend, Pennsylvania State Police Trooper Kevin Foley, and the fact that he was a cop was the very reason Corporal Lade had decided not to send that evidence to the State Police Crime Lab. Lade knew Kevin and she liked him. She had basically trusted him. But as soon as her investigation began, she started hearing stories about how much Kevin seemed to hate John. This was partly because of the allegations that Michelle had made that John had abused JJ. Even though those allegations were ruled to be totally unfounded, it seemed that Kevin completely believed them. And so, Lead had become increasingly paranoid that Kevin was the killer, and she was afraid that her case would be taken over, not by the Attorney General's office, but by the state police. And she was terrified that if Kevin was guilty, she couldn't really trust the State Police Crime Lab to not potentially cover up evidence. Or maybe Kevin would find out about the evidence and try to interfere himself. It was just too risky. And so she didn't want to send the evidence there. So Lead had done something really risky. To keep complete control over her investigation, she had held on to the fingernails and all the tissue samples that were collected at the autopsy, even though she knew they very likely contained the DNA of John's killer. Then she slow-played her investigation, biding her time until she could figure out what to do with those samples. And luckily, the answer came about a year later when the Attorney General took over the case. And that's when Led got her access to the FBI crime lab. The FBI scientists finally tested the DNA that was found under John's fingernails and found that it was a perfect match for Kevin Foley. In the end, State Trooper Kevin Foley was found guilty of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As for Michelle Yelnick, she was never charged in connection with the case. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya!